Can you believe that 71% of US CEOs experience feelings of imposter syndrome? This is according to a 2024 Workforce Global Insights report. When I first read that number, I thought it was really, really high. But when I think about it more, it's true. I know many senior leaders, including myself, who've had periods of imposter syndrome and at times still do, especially when trying something new, jumping into a new initiative, a major project, whatever that may be. We're going to be talking about that in today's video, along with what's happening in the brain that makes that happen and what can we do to overcome imposter syndrome, which is a widespread experience. Imposter syndrome. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about self-doubt and also analysis paralysis. That's one of my previous videos, which if you didn't catch it, it's a good foundation for the discussion we're about to have. What's the difference between those two elements and imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome goes deeper. It actually hits two arms and two pathways or networks within our brain. One is the network of identity, and the other is that of belonging. So let's look into each one of those first. Identity is what we think about ourselves. It's the story that we tell about ourselves. So that if you've had success in academia, as an example, throughout your lifetime, well, you're going to identify yourself as someone who does fairly well. You may think, I'm pretty smart. On the other hand, if you struggled with academia and you failed a lot of exams, you may have the belief that originates from those experiences and says, I'm just not a good test taker. I'm not really smart. Now, whether or not you take it to the level of I'm not really smart, that will also root into some of your other experiences, some of the people around you in your upbringing, those emotional milestones that I talked about in a previous video. I believe it was the ripple effect video, where I talk about those experiences that become rooted in our emotional memory in our midbrain, and that tends to drive how we interact within the world. So if you want more information on that, I recommend you go back to the ripple effect video. When it comes to identity, then, the self-concept or the stories and the narrative that we tell about ourselves does link to these experiences that we have in the past, and then also comes to what the outer expectations are, which leads to the second element, and that is belonging. So in imposter syndrome, as I said, identity is one component, belonging is the other component, and that brings in the social networks of our brain. We all like to feel like we belong to a group. When I was in high school, I was smart. I had that identity of, I did well. I was top of the honor roll or near the top of the honor roll most of the time. I did very well. Into university, I did as well. And then I hit med school and I really struggled. And so my identity was very challenged there. That was a very difficult period that was so surprising to me and created such imprints in my mind that became a significant contributing factor to the imposter syndrome that I then faced for many years later, until I actually got it more into this work and realized how this all works, and was able to rewire all of that and reconfigure and reframe a lot of those ideas. Now, when it comes to the belonging part of it, because I was very smart in high school, I never really felt that I fit into the groups around me. I got along with everybody very well, but well, let's just say it this way. I was never really cool. I never considered myself to be cool. I don't think anybody else around me considered me to be cool. I think people thought I was smart, but the cool factor of being kind of hip and wearing the right things and saying the right things and going to the right parties, that was just not me. I was like, I go to school, I do my activities, I got along with everybody, go to the occasional social event, I go to high school dances, all those things, but I was more or less, I'd go home, I'd go to my piano lesson. So I think that many high achievers can probably relate to that. Not just high achievers in academia, but some people are just very gifted creatively. And so that's a form of your high achievement. Anyways, I never thought myself to be cool. And to this day, I don't think I've ever been cool. However, I do have the sense of being smart, but that was challenged in medical school as well. So I had the identity component and then the belonging component. So that as I progressed and got into different areas of my life, that imposter syndrome of not feeling good enough, feeling inadequate, feeling and having that self-concept of, yes, I'm really smart and I'm good at these things, but I'm not really socially cool. And then not feeling like I fit in because the things that I perceived as being cool, I just wasn't really involved in. I was never a really big party person. I was never a big sports person. I tried, but not very successfully. So all the external markers that would have made me feel cool, I didn't really feel like it aligned. And so as I progressed into greater experiences in my career and having had a big downfall in med school when I failed my licensing exam the first time because I spiraled into self-doubt and analysis paralysis, imposter syndrome on the day of my licensing exam the first time around. Second time around, I got it together. Those things then impacted my professional identity and my professional sense of belonging. So as I went through my career, I always felt misaligned. I didn't really feel like I completely fully belonged because I felt that everybody else around me was so smart and so accomplished. And while I had the objective signs of that, I was getting awards, I was being recognized, I was moving, a lot, advancing in my career into different opportunities. I didn't really fully feel internalized and aligned in that identity and sense of belonging. And so a large part of my career was searching for that alignment. Where I found it was getting involved in education, with developing our residency program at the university I was affiliated with. I got a huge amount of fulfillment there. I worked with a lot of students there. I understood the challenges and the impact that feeling of not being good enough, of feeling as though you're buried under all of this load of an intellectual responsibility, emotional weight of responsibility, everything that comes along with being in medicine. I felt like I really connected with that. And so that aligned with my identity as being an educator, of being someone who's very empathetic, of being someone who believes in excellence, who has achieved excellence. But I found that avenue of identity in order to be able to anchor to that. That then gave me a sense of belonging. I was in an academic environment. I had wonderful colleagues with whom we were on the same mission of educating the residents who are coming through our program. So for those of you who aren't familiar with how it works in medicine, after you finish medical school, you apply to, well, in your last year of medical school, you apply to do a specialty, and then the specialty training you receive, that's in a residency program. So I was very much involved with that. I was surrounded by colleagues. We were all on the same mission. We were all very much dedicated to patient care. We were very much dedicated to educating our residents to help them optimize their performance and their learning and their balance between education and well-being. So I got that sense of belonging there. And then as I progressed and had more experiences, I was able to advance in different opportunities and leadership roles. And now I'm working on the national level and doing all sorts of other really interesting things. But the process of getting to that alignment of identity and self-concept of like, okay, yes, this is who I am and this is what I'm good at, together with having that sense of belonging and being around people who were of similar outlook and mission, that took a while for me to find for two reasons. One, I didn't see it in myself. And two, I didn't see that other people around me were actually in alignment because I couldn't see that alignment in myself. So what's happening then at the brain level to help explain all of this and to help unravel this so that you don't have to be searching for everything for years like I did, so that you can understand where this is coming from and really look at your experience in a targeted way. So the first thing, let's recap again. Every video I do this, but that's okay. I think it's important. You've got your higher brain, also referred to as your upper brain. That's where we do our thinking, processing, regulating, reframing, analyzing, all those things. Then we've got our midbrain, which is where our emotional processing happens. It's where our emotional memories are stored. And then we've got our lower brain, which again connects to the body and then makes us respond in different ways, depending on whether the accelerator is being pressed, the brakes are being pressed, and how aware we are of how to use our brake pedal. Those are the basic sections of the brain and basic elements of our responses. Very simplistic. It is much more complicated with that than that. But again, we're working conceptually with these, with the series. So when it comes to identity, it's the higher part of the brain or the upper brain that is creating a narrative of sorts. It's creating stories where sometimes we don't know the whole story, but we like stories. We like completion. We like thought. So we end up filling in the blanks and creating a story. Depending on our experiences and how we're perceiving and interpreting the world, that creates that narrative. If it is a narrative that is not positive or not solid, what happens is when we feel threatened, if we have a weak narrative, it's going to take us to the protection center of the midbrain. So before I said that's where emotional processing is, that's where our emotional memories are and our imprints are, but it's also where our protection and threat detection center is. So say we have a self-concept like, oh, this feels like high school all over again, and something happens, we're automatically triggering the threat detection center, which doesn't feel good. It heightens us and it puts on the accelerator where our heart races. We might start sweating. We can't think as well. So we can't come up with a response that's a regulated response and a grounded response. We instead become very reactive. And then that can sometimes create the awkward silences, which then reinforces the self-concept of like, okay, I'm really not cool. And then it just goes into the threat zone and becomes this cycle, right? Makes sense? So that's the identity part. The belonging part is very similar. We have other parts of our brain, which are also rooted in the upper brain, which are looking at social cues and evaluating those social cues so that if we feel an alignment or someone smiles and we feel welcoming, we get a little dopamine release, which is part of our reward system, and then that makes us feel good. But if we don't get that, it then again becomes sensed as a form of threat. And then that then triggers the accelerator side. How do we then change all of this so that that experience, a disconnect between identity and belonging, which then translates to imposter syndrome, which then translates into I'm not good enough from an identity standpoint, I don't belong here from a belonging standpoint. How do we take that and shift to let's turn on the brakes so our system can relax. And so we can actually recognize that, hey, I am good enough from an identity standpoint, and I do belong from a belonging standpoint. There are 4 ways that we can do this to help overcome this imposter syndrome. And I've been through this multiple times. I went through it from medical school into residency where, like I said, I struggled and then I did very well in residency. But because I struggled so deeply, that emotional imprint was there. I couldn't really connect to the success of residency. And then, like I said, I moved into academia, felt connected. A few things you can do. Number 1 is recognize your strengths and what you bring to the table. What that does is that engages a process where you're actually intellectually thinking about it. And then in that reinforcement, it helps create an identity narrative in your higher brain or your upper brain that then when things come at you, because you've identified and primed yourself for being competent in your identity, it doesn't trigger the accelerator so much. It goes through the pathway that will trigger your brakes, or at least keep your system calm. The next thing you can do is visualization. In our social brain, we have a few different mechanisms that come into play, one of which is mirroring, and you may have heard of this. So for example, if you're in a meeting and you're getting along with somebody very well, they take a drink, you just subconsciously take a drink. You don't even realize you're doing it, but you're mirroring each other. It's a form of alignment with that other person. When you imagine having good interactions, then go into a situation where you may not have felt comfortable otherwise, but say you thought about shaking somebody's hand and having a very positive interaction, that primes your mirroring network within your brain so that when you go into that situation, you've already experienced the positivity, which then will allow you to say that, hey, this is okay. And then that becomes something that reinforces the fact that you are able to connect with other people and therefore you belong in that environment. So we talked about the identity piece with the affirmations of like, yes, that I am good enough. I do bring this value to the table. I do have these strengths. And now we're talking about the belonging piece where you're doing that visualization to be able to connect with other people. So that also is a way of challenging the circuitry that is keeping you in imposter syndrome. The third thing you can do is the 3 R's: reflect, reframe, respond, which we talked about in other videos. There is a video specifically on that as well, where you reflect and say, I'm feeling uneasy here. I'm noticing that I'm feeling inadequate and I'm feeling like I don't belong. Recognizing that, knowing now that it's identity and belonging, those are the 2 aspects that underlie imposter syndrome, you can, in that moment, reframe that experience as saying, okay, I realize I'm feeling imposter syndrome. In this situation, I have these things to contribute. I have the presence of mind to be able to give a good opinion. If you don't think you know enough to be able to contribute off the cuff, I can always respond and add a perspective. So I'm here bringing value in terms of the perspective that I can bring to the table when I feel inspired to do so. The other thing too is to reframe it as I'm part of this group. We've been brought together for some reason. It's an opportunity to explore what is the commonality? What makes it so that we were all brought into this group together? Is there something here that becomes that thread of belonging? And then you respond accordingly by recognizing that when you're feeling like you're in imposter syndrome, the accelerator is going to be geared to go in high. You then apply the brakes with techniques that I've talked about in the video on analysis paralysis, but to quickly recap as an example, you can do deep breathing. You can't necessarily hum if you're at a gathering and you're feeling nervous, but you can ground yourself. Think about your feet. Be very aware of the soles of your feet touching the ground. Look for different colors in the room. You're engaging that part of your brain, which is further away from your emotional center, which is where your threat center is. That distance allows you to help press on the brakes a little bit. And then after that, you can respond in a very grounded way where you're feeling present because you've tempered that threat detection center, which is the goal of these different exercises that I'm talking about now and that I've talked about in the analysis paralysis video. If you really want to dive even deeper, the way to really rewire this, because what we've talked about before will help you handle this in the moment. And over time, you'll develop the patterns which will rewire it. But if you really want to go deep and look at an intrinsic rewiring, which can be very transformative, and I've experienced this. This is from some work by Dr. Alok Trivedi. What you can do is you take that emotional milestone that I talked about before, which are those experiences that have been so emotionally weighted that they imprint in your brain. I refer to those as emotional milestones. And you can take a look at the very moment that those traumatic things happen to you, and you can look at the advantages and benefits that you had from those experiences. And on the other side of it, if you didn't have those experiences, what learning have you missed out on? When you recognize both sides of it, it helps balance the experience. It lessens that emotional weight. It lifts the imprint somewhat, and it becomes something you become grateful for, which is helps unravel that from keeping you stuck down and rooted in imposter syndrome. Now, this is work that I do in a lot of my workshops and in consulting if I'm doing training in different organizations or groups. So in my case, where I struggled in medical school, where I felt disconnected when I first came into the profession, the experience of having failed the exam the first time around has made me a much more empathetic educator. It made me a much more empathetic mentor. It made me a leader who is very mindful of how everyone is doing from a mindset standpoint. It also helped me understand when someone's anxious and nervous, how do you help them optimize their performance so that they don't get caught up in the same cycles that I had gotten into. I would not have had those experiences and those insights had I not failed the exam. On the other side of it, I saw how loving and supportive my parents and my family was, and how supportive they were in that time where I felt devastated. So if I would not have had that experience, I would not have seen how much true support was around me that was unconditional. So that external measure of belonging, external measure of success that I had been so used to putting myself weighing myself against or measuring myself against, a lot of that became neutralized and eliminated. So that's made me less fearful of trying new things, making mistakes, making videos, making mistakes in my videos, sharing my thoughts with you. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't agree. If not, I would love to hear your input. I would love to hear your feedback and insights. So let's talk about it because I'm always open to learning. I know there are multiple ways of doing things, and these are things that I learned though because of those experiences. So I share that with you so that this gives you a perspective on imposter syndrome. To summarize then, to recap, imposter syndrome is really about two elements. It's identity and belonging, which takes it past self-doubt, analysis paralysis. Those are different things. I recommend you watch that video. And then to overcome imposter syndrome, use things like your affirmation and rebuilding your narrative by looking at your strengths and successes. And if you've had challenges, what did you learn from them? The second thing is to do exercises to get your brakes going instead of your accelerator going in your autonomic or your automatic nervous system responses. The third thing is to use the 3 Rs. Reflect, reframe, respond. We've talked about this in other videos. You can recap in that as well. And the fourth thing is look at your emotional milestones and look at what did you gain from it and what would you not have learned had you not had those difficult experiences. Imposter syndrome can be managed. It can be overcome. It just takes a little bit of work. And remember that everything that comes your way is there to teach you. And if you maintain that outlook, that in itself becomes a really positive way to transition from going from imposter syndrome to having some healthy self-doubt and avoiding the analysis paralysis as well. I hope you enjoyed that. Please do watch some of those other videos. It'll really complete the picture. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and thanks for taking the time to spend with me today.